week we're going to be working on power distribution. So I thought I'd start off for you with a little bit of a description since this isn't really common knowledge. Maybe you do or don't know about it a little bit, but somehow we have to get electricity spread throughout our commercial build out so that people can plug stuff in or wire stuff in. So let's see how the electricity gets there. First, we start off with somebody running a power plant and extra high voltage. Those are things like in the 30 to 60,000 volts. Touch that and you're a goner. But those come from the big plants, the coal plants, the hydroelectric plants, the nuclear power plants, places that are really cranking out a ton of energy, and that's called baseline power because you can't turn these things on and off. They're just on all the time, and they're fairly efficient. Then you can get also going into the grid some smaller plants. Those are usually called topping plants that turn on when the power requirement gets a little bit higher. Those are located in factories, maybe an industrial power plant or a medium-sized power plant, and those are really high voltage, so they're really cranking also. All right, and so those two come together, and then they have to get distributed. They go through the big wires, the big transmission wires that you see up and down our state, and then something kind of happens. So it changes from transmission to distribution. And as distribution happens, there's what they call step down facilities that get it closer and closer to what we need in our communities. So every now and then you'll see what's called a substation that knocks it down to maybe 1,000 volts or 600 volts or something like that. And those go to, and sometimes there'll even be a city power plant, solar farms or wind farms, but eventually it's got to get to somebody. And that's where you see the power poles that were more commonly seen. A lot of times they'll bury those too. And those go to city networks, houses, rural networks, and farming networks. And these city networks, they might be houses, they might be businesses, they might be schools, they might be hospitals, but it all gets distributed. And that's where eventually you'll get a line coming down one of these poles that will be that 240 volts that normally comes into most commercial and residential buildings. So it starts out great big wires, high voltage. That's the stuff that'll really zap you, and high current, and then it's might get added to a little bit on the way in topping stations, and then you might have solar farms and wind farms adding to those, putting it into the distribution grid, but eventually it goes into what's called the low voltage area, which is like 1200 volts, 600 volts, and that gets spread throughout the community, and eventually something goes into your building. And often that's 240 volts because that's what most of our stuff runs off of. And as you're going to see a little bit later on, it's actually 208 volts that we spread out through buildings because that's easily turned into 110 volts, which many of our appliances run on. Now, you might think everything that you normally plug in runs on that 110 volt, but actually very few things do. Most things run on 5, 10, or 24 volt DC, and they have transformers inside of them. And that's because AC transmits easier than direct current. So we transmit and distribute with AC, And then when we need to run a motor, most of them are most efficient on DC, and they transform there. So as an example, your refrigerator motor is actually a DC motor. It's got a transformer in it. Your washing machine and your dryer motors are DC motors. Your computer, even though you're plugging it in, is actually a DC device, and there's a transformer. And many, many, many lights now are also DC, direct current. That happens at the device. We still need to distribute to the plugs. So how does that happen? It comes to a power panel, and here you see a power panel, and at the top is what's called the main breaker. And so there will be 3 or 4 wires. Mostly what you're going to see is 4 wires coming in from this power grid. Maybe there's a power pole nearby or a power box nearby, and somebody in a conduit will pull 4 wires, and they'll hook into this thing called a main circuit breaker. Those 4 wires will come in, and then 4 wires will come out. And this is basically a safety switch, so that if something goes wrong, the whole thing can get shut off immediately and not cause a health hazard or a fire. Okay, so that's your main coming in, and then different boxes have a different number of these things. These are each called circuit breakers, and those are individual circuits that go out and feed receptacles, junction boxes, lights. They might, instead of be plugs, they might be something like your oven. Okay, and sometimes those get wired in directly in a junction box, and sometimes there's just a receptacle. This is a 110 receptacle. 208 receptacles look a little different, but that somebody pulls wires from here to the receptacle, wires it up to the plug, and puts a cap on it, and then you can plug it in, and your power gets there. Okay, so that's how our power gets to where we need to go. And we need to do some high level set of planning so that somebody could do all of this work. So that's what this week is really all about. Let's see what that week is going to consist of. We're going to do our power design. Okay, I've got some videos for you. I've got the assignment guide. We've got our templates, as always. Let's see what the assignment guide is going to look like. Let me turn this back on so we can see. You're going to create power zones. You're going to learn a little bit about power distribution panels. That's this thing right here. We're going to place power loads. That's these things right here. We're not doing lighting this week. We're going to do lighting next week. Okay, and we're going to do it in 2 areas. Okay, we're going to do it in the admin area and the manufacturing areas, and then we'll do our documentation sheets. On the power distribution guide, I've got a set of drawings for you that you can look at to do your detailed drawings. Okay, and I will put on here some samples. You've got samples in here for you to look at, but I'll put some samples in here, some links to samples so that you know what those should look like. Okay, so there we go. That is sort of our lecture for the week. We're going to work on electricity, power distribution, and next week we'll look on the lighting electrical. There we go.